Good morning, everybody. Mike and Corey here today, kicking off this Monday as the weather starts to get colder where we're at least up in Ohio. Today's topics we're going to cover, you know, things go up, things go down. Corey's going to talk about are stocks overvalued? Are they getting expensive? And he's going to show you some numbers to kind of get into that. I'm going to talk about the S&P 500 and kind of how it's composed and the idea of market cap, and that you'll have a certain overweight without even knowing it. And then last, I'm going to talk about an article I saw about where we are getting our news. But before we get started, I must remind you, this is a financial education presentation. You must do your own due diligence on anything that you hear in this presentation. More disclaimer information can be found on ankerstarwealth.com, and the opinions expressed are mine and Corey's alone. So I'm gonna let Corey kick it off with the stocks.
Yeah, let's do it. This is so from one of my favorite bloggers out there and podcasters as well, Ben Carlson. This is a wealth of common sense blog. So this one he posted on November 15th, a couple days ago. And the question is, are U.S. stocks overvalued? So he reiterates politicians don't control the stock market, and we want to make that distinction. There are certainly policies and things that can impact valuations, and of course the Federal Reserve has a big role in that as well. But a lot of times when we're thinking about stock prices and valuations, it's sort of around perception of growth and perception of the economy. That's real. So really, there's a lot of subjectivity there, and that's kind of a hard thing to accept. Okay, so looking at on election day, forward PE ratios. So this is next year, 2025 earnings, projected earnings. The S&P 500 was at a 22.3. And then you've got the small and mid caps were down around a 16.9. 16.9 is kind of an average, kind of longer term. You can even see that on this chart. And you can see that 22 is elevated, not the highest. We were a little higher in 2019 at one point, but elevated potentially. So here's the actual values. Okay, we kind of saw that on the chart. And again, a PE ratio, that's a price to earnings ratio. So what are these companies in the S&P 500 earning on a per share basis? And, what does that look like historically? And we pay a multiple for those earnings when we buy at a given price. So actual earnings trends, earnings are still trending up and hitting $235 per share of the S&P 500 for those large cap stocks. You can see that mid cap and small cap stocks, probably because of some debt, higher interest rates, their earnings have been under pressure since 2022 when rates began increasing. So stocks are a little bit cheaper now versus September of 2020. So the S&P was all the way down at 3,581 in September of 2020, around 6,000 now. But we are a little bit cheaper on a forward price to earnings basis. Elevated according to historical terms, sure, but cheaper than we were, at that particular point. Okay, now looking at next year's projected earnings, $168 a share. Again, that's projected. There are things that could change that. But I thought this was really interesting, Mike. The average PE ratio of the top 10 companies is about 50.
There you
go. But why? So Tesla, Broadcom, Nvidia, Eli Lilly, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Meta, Berkshire and Alphabet, not bad. Those are just slightly above historical averages, and they're high quality. But he reiterates that these are expensive for good reason. These are some of the best run companies in the world. They have amazing moats, and they have amazing margins. So the premium is kind of warranted. Maybe there's one out there at the front that
although that one's up about 5 or 6% today, so
yeah,
maybe not.
That's do you remember when I said earlier about perception? That one has a lot of perception going on, both ways.
Yep.
So anyway, there are other parts of the market here. He says that they are not expensive at all. So, and he mentions, or one of the things that Mike mentioned a week ago was that you might see some energy positions popping up throughout your portfolios, and that's a part of the market that is it's not historically super dirt cheap, but it's trading at an extremely fair valuation, and it's a safe place to put money to work, with this administration and just historically, it's very fair value. So there's places to look out there, and there's some things to watch out for. There's some landmines, but all in all, it's not off the charts.
Well, I'll throw into that. I mean, everything is really based on growth. If a company's growing, then the earnings might not be as high, but you're looking at that higher multiple price to the PE ratio that Corey showed. So if you believe a company's growing, then yes, you should invest in it and expect that to grow into it. If you think a company is more, let's just say, solid, putting off a dividend, I'll take like P&G or something like that. It's not growing near as much, but it's putting off a solid dividend. The PE ratio will be much lower, and that's kind of how it should be. Yes, it should be. Let me show you, and this fits right into what I want to talk about, which is, Corey showed those top stocks that have the highest PE ratio. What I'm showing right here on my screen are the top stocks by market capitalization. So that's shares outstanding times price. And this is kind of the value of the company. So you can see Apple and NVIDIA and Microsoft have all been bouncing around that top spot. NVIDIA really came out of nowhere. I shouldn't say out of nowhere, but it surged up in the last couple years. But you can see all the companies he showed there: Google, Amazon, Meta, Tesla. Berkshire Hathaway is a holding company, but it holds a lot of Apple, although they've reduced their share. So, in Broadcom, Eli Lilly. So, I mean, these are the biggest companies in the world. And I was going to test Corey and say, how many do you think are worth over $1 trillion? And you can see on this screen, as of right now, there's 8 of them. And then how many are worth over?
I would have said like 6 or 7.
6. Yeah. He probably wouldn't have got, because Tesla just got there in the last week again. And Berkshire Hathaway probably just came up.
Berkshire's been bobbing around. Berkshire's been.
But the other 6, those are pretty easy to get. But here's an interesting question. How many are worth over $500 million? And there's really only 16. Now, this is U.S. companies. Taiwan Semiconductor's in there, and Novo is close. So there's 2 that are outside the United States. But, there's only 16 companies listed right now that are over $500 million, which is a lot. So when you buy the S&P 500, which you may pick this in your 401k, or you may hear someone say, just invest in the S&P 500. What are you getting? You're not getting 500 equal shares of companies. You're getting a weighted amount. So NVIDIA on this chart here is 7%. So if you put $100 into the S&P 500, you're putting $7 into NVIDIA, just so you know. Putting almost $7 into Apple, $6 into Microsoft, and it goes down to where, like, if I scroll down to number 500, you're probably putting 20 cents into it. So these top companies drive the S&P 500. Trying to be a little bit precise, I downloaded those top through Visa, and that's 41% of the S&P 500 is those 15 companies. If you sum them up, it's 41%. So you're really not getting as broad exposure as you might think you are. Now, the good news is the S&P 500, the top 10 stocks have done phenomenal the last few years. So guess what? The S&P 500 has done as well. But if those top 10 stocks start to come down because of the PE ratio that Corey talks about, those 10 stocks could start to come down and the other 490 could go up and it'd almost be an even split. So you just got to realize that those are the dog that's wagging the tail. So, so the other topic I wanted to cover today was, since I still have a newspaper, and I get a subscription, and I really don't watch television news, the old news stations. I thought this was an interesting graph, and you'll understand where I'm going with this. This is the percentage of people with confidence in the television news and newspaper institutions. It comes from Gallup, and you can see that it has declined, which may or may not, probably does not surprise you. The next stat I want to show you, this is the newspaper circulation from across the United States, and you can see obviously it's dropping. Sunday papers, weekday papers, everything. And you say, well, of course, everybody's getting their stuff online, which is true. I mean, a lot of people get their news online now. But here's the scary thing, a little scarier to me. 1 in 5 Americans get their news from social media influencers. So interesting.
Is that us?
I don't think so. I hope we're not the 1 in 5, but maybe we're the social media influencers. This is posted on YouTube, so I guess technically no. I don't want. I'm thinking they're much bigger people than us. So, anyways, the scary thing as I think about this is, there's a loss of confidence in the news media. So that's unfortunate. It could be due to multiple reasons. We won't get into it. But now there's a shift to more, at least 1 in 5, and maybe this is certainly demographically. Corey probably does this, but I don't. The younger people maybe trust social media influencers, right? So if I'll make up, I don't even know who, Mr. Beast. I don't know if he's a social media, I don't know. But if he says this is the way it goes, or if, maybe Joe Rogan, or could be anybody, if they say this is the way it is, people are starting to get their trust in news from them. I don't know what this means long term, although it makes me a little nervous when you think about, they talk about Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and we hear all of this, TikTok, passing information about stocks, passing about politics, obviously unregulated. So I don't know. Corey, where do you get your news from?
Well, I don't, I try, this is probably wrong. I don't really trust anything you read anymore. I try to just sort of get a feel for my real life experiences out there and kind of go based on that, because you read things online that don't seem to match up with the real life experiences all the time. I will say, this reminds me, you heard a lot back in the 90s. There were people talking about the democratization of information, where these voices that had never been heard before will be heard, and I think that's really what this is. These people who would have never been heard in the past are being heard now. And yeah, to your point, in some ways that's a good thing, and in other ways, depending on how it's being used, it could be bad, right? And I guess that's true for any media source. So yeah. I do like the idea that good voices don't have to be tied to a corporation in a
Correct.
sense.
Yeah. There's no moat around getting your information out. So, you could create your own podcast, create your own YouTube channel, put content out there very, very inexpensively. Honestly, you just do it with your computer and a mic. You can upload it. It's all free. So I love that we have a freedom of speech, at least on the internet, that's like, now, whether it's promoted or shared, I mean, that's a whole nother story. But the cost of putting that out, it's not like you got to create your own news station.
Right.
Of course, and I will say that, since I lived in the 90s and I was an adult in the 90s. I mean, it used to be harder to get financial information, not super difficult like in the 80s, but harder. Now there's an overwhelming amount of information, some of it bad, some of it good, and now you got to try to read and decipher. But I guarantee I could search on, stock studies and projections for NVIDIA, who has earnings coming out later this week, and I could find 1,000 or 10,000 articles, more than I ever possibly could read. So It's more of how do you intake and figure out what's legit, what's not, and I agree that there's a certain amount of gut feel in there too. So
I think with some of those podcasters too, what you'll hear them say is, in the past, there's there's so many podcasts now. Many very, very famous people have their own podcasts, and what some of them have said is, if they were on TV, they would sort of have to cater their content for the advertisers. So it really, in a sense, wasn't their content. It was this curated content to sort of satisfy the needs of the corporation and the advertisers. And by having your own podcast sponsored by yourself or just whatever advertisers come to you, maybe there's less of that. Is that all true? I don't know, but I've heard that.
We can throw in a disclaimer that Corey and I were not influenced by advertisers on this presentation. Nobody has slid us any money to cover any content. So
that's right.
With that, we'll let you get back, because I know so many of you listened to the end of this interesting conversation. But have a great rest of the week, and we will have our show tomorrow. Bye.